Good afternoon, Ajax. Welcome, and thank you for tuning into part 3 of our Town of Ajax Diversity Exchange speaker series presented by the Ajax Anti-Black Racism Task Force. My name is Natasha Sharma, and I'm the Diversity and Inclusion Coordinator at Town of Ajax. We are joining you here today remotely from various locations due to the COVID-19 restrictions and precautions. We appreciate your patience and understanding should we have any technical difficulties during this live program. We would like to assure you that there is a technical team working behind the scenes today. And if we experience any issues, we will be back up and running on the same platform as soon as possible. Today, as the presentation and discussion takes place, we do encourage our audience to submit any questions, comments, and reflections down below in the comment sections. We also have our social media team behind the scenes, and they will be able to relay a few of your questions during the Q&A portion after the speaker's presentation. If we are unable to get to all of your questions today, we will follow up with you and ensure you receive all the necessary information and resources. So now, I would like to introduce you to our facilitator for today, Dane Lawrence, our Vice Chair to the Ajax Anti-Black Racism Task Force, and proud Ajax resident and owner and business owner. We will begin the program today with our land acknowledgements. Over to you, Dane.
Thank you, Natasha. We would like to begin the program this afternoon by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is situated within the traditional and treaty territory of the Mississaugas. More specifically, the Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nation, signatories of the Gunshot Treaty of 1788 and the Williams Treaty of 1923. This land is and will continue to be home of the Indigenous peoples. Let us acknowledge the mistakes and traumas of the past through authenticity and support truth and reconciliation. Let us engage and celebrate Indigenous communities by being leaders of action in acknowledging the United States Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's recommendations towards truth and reconciliation. Let us keep these principles close as we continue truth and reconciliation, and as we move forward with kindness and respect as a community. Let us also acknowledge those who have entered the land by force, particularly as a result of the transatlantic slave trade. Through the work of the Ajax Anti-Black Racism Task Force, anchored to the pillars of the UN International Decade of Peoples of African Descent, let us endeavor to connect our communities and efforts to uplift the traditions of this land. So good afternoon and hello Ajax. My name is Dane Lawrence, and I am pleased to facilitate this speaker series today, hosted by the Ajax Diversity Exchange and the Ajax Anti-Black Racism Task Force. The task force was assembled to listen to local Black voices and initiate concrete actions to support the Black community and other racialized groups in Ajax. Today we have the third installment of our 5-part speaker series. Our chair, Mariska Thomas, and members of the AABR task force are incredibly happy to be part of this series. And thank you for joining us. The topic being discussed is demystifying mental health. Our guest speaker will be presenting on this topic, followed by a question and answer period. We encourage viewers to interact and submit your questions in the comments section below. Our guest speaker, or our guest presenter for the afternoon, is Nicole Pearman, Executive Director of IFRADA. IFRADA is a Center for Excellence, a nonprofit organization in Durham Region specialized in African-centered and holistic counseling, educating, and mentoring programs. She's co-founded the Kajenga Family Wellness Project, which focuses on supporting Black families in the Durham region. She has over 20 years experience in child welfare, children and adult mental health, and community development. She is an equity subject matter expert, college professor, and supervisor for graduate and diploma students. Let us welcome, Nicole possesses an MA in counseling and psychology, a master's in social work degree, and a certified play therapist. Now, to begin the conversations, we now have Nicole Perriman on demystifying mental health. Over to you, Nicole.
Thank you, Dane. I want to express my thanks to the Anti-Black Racism Task Force, Natasha Sharma, Mariska Thomas, Dane yourself, the technical engineers, and the town of Ajax for hosting the speaker series. I am delighted to talk about my favorite topic, demystifying mental health. I didn't come here alone. I came on this journey from my experiences, the stories and journeys of my ancestors, my aunties, my parents, my uncles, my village, and my community. They have shaped my understanding of mental health, of community investment, and building and reframing how we perceive our community. One of my presentations I have done before is called Building Resilience in Mental Health. And as a community, we've not always had the opportunity to be able to focus on mental health. We have focused on education, career, socializing, and very rarely have had talks and conversations about mental health. So I have 45 minutes, so I'll do my best to continue this conversation. Let's roll. Thank you. The land acknowledgement is a key piece of our experience, and the acknowledgement forges a commitment to friendship and addressing the inequities that continue against Indigenous people. As a settler here in Durham region, I have a unique responsibility to ensure that I reside on these lands in friendship and that I honor the people who have inhabited these lands well before my ancestors were stolen and shipped here. Furthermore, I enjoy these privileges in my home where my many Indigenous communities, they have not been able to be afforded these privileges. So thus it is our responsibility to acknowledge the land, the agreements, and the commitments the government has made with the Indigenous people. Last year, many organizations began to acknowledge the impact of anti-Black racism in the lives of our children, our youth, our families, and our community. And Black people have contributed to the fabric and the foundation of this country, but they continue to experience negative outcomes. Anti-Black racism is embedded within Canadian institutions, its policies and practices, and our government has not done enough to address this inequity. So through the efforts of the Anti-Black Racism Task Force, the town of Ajax, they are creating some safe spaces for Black voices to speak and share their truth. My first question to you today is, why are you here? As I begin this presentation, I want to encourage you to set your intentions for today. As Natasha shared, please feel free to ask questions throughout. Give yourself some time to have pauses, tune into yourself. I encourage you to examine, how is my body feeling? What are my thoughts? How does my heart feel as we walk through this journey of demystifying mental health? We will discuss wellness. We will understand how stigma has its place. I will skim through identifying the impact of intergenerational trauma and discuss the signs and symptoms of unwellness. And I will close with a summary of how you can support yourself and your family. Before we start, I want to clarify what is wellness, as you will hear me say this topic very often throughout the presentation. The World Health Organization, which you all know over the past year, defines wellness as an optimal state of health of individuals and groups, and wellness is expressed as a positive approach to living. Here, I will describe wellness as almost a balancing act, as we need to do as we experience life stressors and difficulties. Our life experiences can become difficult. Didn't we all are going through the pandemic together, right? So our wellness can determine how well we adapt and change to these challenges. Wellness is like how we build resiliency. Resiliency is the ability to adapt and change in the midst of life difficulties and struggles. And so our wellness is our ability to engage in activities that help motivate us to remain resilient. There are multiple viewpoints of wellness. Today I'm going to talk about 7 main dimensions of wellness, which include spirituality, emotional, relational, environmental, and career. By creating balance in each of those areas, you may also be able to achieve a state of wellness. There are also multiple belief systems about how people can achieve and care for their physical and emotional well-being. For example, in Indigenous-based holistic teaching, creating balance in all areas of your life will help to promote healing and wellness. There's a concept called two-eyed seeing, which is relevant here. In two-eyed seeing, it refers to, and I quote, learning to see from one eye with the strengths of Indigenous knowledge and ways of knowing, and in the other eye with the strengths of Western knowledge and ways of knowing. And similarly, African cultures also view mental wellness as a holistic approach. So for example, if you feel pain within your physical body or ailments, it may be due to also the function of the mind and the spirit. And then in treatment, you just don't focus on, medications that may help the body, but you also focus on creating some balance between the mind and the spirit. As we strive for wellness, it's really important to address how many people experience external influences that can impact their overall wellness. And many of these experiences occur without our control. For example, within the Black community, our identity, our cultural experiences, the evidence of systemic oppression, the intergenerational experiences and trauma can definitely impact and influence our wellness. Each of the dimensions that you will see here has unique needs and activities that you would engage in to develop balance. What I encourage you to do today is think about what are some of the practices that you already do to manage each of these areas of yourself, and what are the barriers that may exist or make it difficult for you to be able to manage these wellness areas. And closer to the end of the presentation, I'll talk about each one and provide you examples of how to do so. Understanding stigma. Stigma has its place in history. There are so many stigmas associated with mental health in the Black community, and some of these stigmas stem from practices way before we came here through colonization in the early 1400s, where Black bodies were forced into slavery and cheap labor. And further, in the 1960s to present, stigma about mental illness became reinforced in our culture and our identity within the Black community. I focus on the Black community because it is the identity that I ascribe to, but stigma in mental health exists in many different cultures, many different communities. So here's my ask for you today. What is your story? I remember being a young girl and witnessing family members who struggled with addictions and mental health. There was always a constant fear that if we talked about mental health, that those people would be institutionalized. For example, my grandmother spent some time in an institution, and that was all I knew. I was taught that mental illness was passed down through generations, possibly skipping a generation, and I learned that conviction and prayer were the only ways of cleansing one from mental health. But we never talked about why, about mental health issues existed, and what was the function of the behaviors associated with addictions. Some of the beliefs about mental illness include mental illness is caused by an evil spirit, that people who are unwell have been punished because they did bad things, people with mental illness are weak, possibly lazy, those stereotypes. And even today, many of those stereotypes remain true. There's also stigma around beliefs around coping and treatment, which reinforce the stigma about mental health. For example, counseling and psychiatry doesn't cure mental illness. If you talk about having a mental illness, then you'll automatically be institutionalized and have to be on medications for the rest of your life. That it's better to resolve mental health issues by going to the church or spirituality, or that mental illness can be cured with homemade recipes and remedies. But don't get me wrong. I am not saying that these efforts don't help. I am encourage you to look at mental health and addressing mental health issues on a balanced and diversified approach. What was really interesting was nobody ever told me about the trauma that my grandmother experienced early in her life, the abuse that she also endured, the displacement she experienced in her life, and being disconnected from her community. And they never talked about the public ridicule that came when she started to have challenges with her mental health. Nobody told me about her inner pain or the circumstances that led to her institutionalization for a period of time. So then what are the messages that you learned about mental health? What are the experiences that you also had to endure? An important part of deconstructing mental health is understanding how systems can reinforce shame and disconnection from seeking help. These stigmas make it difficult for Black community members to access support when they need to, and further discourage them from creating wellness in their life. Stigma passes down through generations. Thus, it is important, and I encourage you to work on dispelling some of these myths about mental health and really speaking to our young people about how they can create wellness in their life and also care for their mental health. There are real experiences in our community that endures, that can burn the soul. I read an article that talked about healing race trauma. And in the article the author writes, racial trauma is a form of interpersonal violence that can lacerate the spirit, puncture the psyche, and scar the soul. And I will say it again. Racial oppression is a traumatic form of interpersonal violence which can lacerate the spirit, scar the soul, and puncture the psyche. Thus, our experiences as individuals can impact our mental wellness, and also assaulting our sense of self. We can start to feel constantly devalued and believing that we're worthless. It can also make us feel that we are helpless and don't have a voice, and it can stir wounds and pains within us. There is a belief system in our community that we need to be strong. We need to be resilient, and we need to prove to the world that we're better than the stereotypes and beliefs that define us. But it is hard. Thus, when you think about your own wellness, the wellness in your family, your children, and your people, I want you to consider how you can intentionally create spaces and reinforce safety, reduce stigma, and provide safety for young people to be able to use their voices, because we don't do this alone. This is a very unique quote that highlights the systems embedded in our culture dismiss the impact of mental health issues, but this quote has its place. There was a time when our ancestors, as we shared before, were enslaved, and that their very survival was dependent upon them continuing when they were fed up. Having difficulties with one's mental health at that time was a poor reflection of themselves on the individual, in their family, and in their community. And I'll give an example. I have the privilege of working with a young people from a particular community and from the continent of Africa. And their mental health is a concept that's not really discussed in that community, but these clients are part of a culture or a community that has survived centuries of trauma, and post-traumatic stress is woven through their identity, so how they see themselves and how they see the world. So for an example, when my clients express, sometimes they feel tired, their elders and their aunties would say they're lazy. And when my clients use their voice, their family members would consider them disrespectful. And when my clients make choices about their bodies, they're considered westernized and selfish. This community, the very fabric of their being, was based on fighting through horrific atrocities. And their ancestors and elders continued fighting even when they didn't have any strength. and they never showed any weakness because they do. And I share this example to highlight that it is okay to be fed up, it's okay to be tired, and it's absolutely okay to decide not to fight. And it is not a reflection of being weak. So yes, anti-Black racism does create trauma. The data shows that our young people have higher unemployment rates. They're most likely to drop out of school. We know that poverty is intergenerational, much like Indigenous communities. And we know that many Black people can be forced into generations of poverty. Systemic racism can lead to over-surveillance of Black people, which leads to over-criminalization, which leads to disconnection from their communities and their home. Have you experienced a family member being murdered, young people exposed to human trafficking, young people in jail? These are my experiences. These are my clients' experiences. Even COVID-19 has showed us the inequities within the Black community. The rates or the experiences of Black people within COVID-19 is also inequitable and also demonstrates disparities. Another issue is that when our young people don't see themselves represented in their community, they often feel as if they don't have a lot of support and they don't have the hope that they need to be able to achieve their dreams or achieve their goals. 2 months ago, Robert Small on this very platform had shared the stories of Black excellence. What is really important in his talk is that we don't often see ourselves represented in the community, and as a result, we may not see it possible to achieve our goals, which is why talking about Black excellence is extremely important. I also work closely with a school in Durham region, and listening to those young people always give me a lot of hope and inspires me to do the work that I do. So this year, the young people also talked about their own experiences within the high school, and they shared, feelings of not being represented, not knowing how to navigate the world once they leave high school, and not feeling themselves being supported as other high school students in their classrooms. It is important to remember that our identity impacts our mental health. So it's not the fault of the family. We need to do our healing. There are so many changes which need to occur, from policies and practices about Black people and how we relate to and speaking with each other, and the perceptions and the stereotypes that are held about Black people. A few days ago, I had the privilege of attending a talk, and the speaker shared that some of our families are dysfunctional. Some of our families are dysfunctional, and I disagreed wholeheartedly. Our families are placed in impossible situations in a system that was designed for them to fail. It was designed to lead them to prison, to keep them in poverty, and to reinforce mental illness. Our family's experience of anti-Black racism really begins from birth and carries them through our death. So it absolutely will influence and impact our mental health. So I want to give you a moment to just check in, to just think about what's coming up for you, to share with others and share in the chat how you're feeling and what feelings are coming to mind. In this next slide, I've listed some symptoms related to mental health. These symptoms can impact our physical body through disease, panic attacks, muscle pains, to impacting our mindset, our emotions, our thinking patterns, and our moods. If you experience any of these symptoms, you probably say to me, Nicole, this is normal. Everyone feels this way sometimes. And I absolutely agree. And it can be normal. But what's concerning is when some of these symptoms continue on for weeks or months at a time, you start to notice changes in your lifestyle or interruptions in your everyday life. Then you know it's time to access support. Mental wellness can extend into our families. Remember, I shared some real experiences that may occur within your home. These experiences can change us, can debilitate us, and destabilize our families. I remember working with a family whose daughter was struggling with mental health challenges, and she was in and out of the hospital seeking support. She also struggled with addictions. Unfortunately, that young person had passed away. And in deconstructing the impact of her mental health, every person in that family was impacted. Whether they felt guilty because they weren't doing enough, or sadness because she was gone, or just even the grief because she was no longer with them anymore. And these experiences impact families. There are other situations and difficulties that also impact our families, which intersect with race and identity. For example, and you can tell me if you experience any of these: financial instability, involvement with the police, health inequities, or just difficulty navigating the health system, intimate partner violence, parents feeling overworked or having to work multiple hours, multiple shifts, feeling of social isolation, experiences of trauma, and grief and loss. For us, these experiences can very much influence our daily functioning and increase the stressors that we experience. So I come to this quote. Taraji P. Henson wrote, "First of all, it's impossible for any human being to always be strong. I'm always apprehensive of the term strong Black woman because it dehumanizes us and makes it seem like we don't hurt." I want to give time to pause again. What messages do you hold about being strong? Which do you continue to hold for yourself and your community and your loved ones? Finally, sometimes our mental health can be triggered by other events that are outside of our control, such as emotional trigger or just overall life stressors. Pay attention to your own behavior and thought patterns to watch for any challenges or symptoms that you may be experiencing. It's also important to listen to your friends and loved ones because sometimes they might highlight changes that they notice within you before you even notice within yourself. One of the myths, as I identified earlier, is whether mental illness is hereditary and how does it truly pass on to our genes. I'll start with a definition. I've used this term many times, trauma, throughout this presentation. Trauma is defined as experiences that may impact an individual's capacity in their regular functioning. We have all experienced trauma. The pandemic alone was actually a very traumatic experience. What makes trauma into post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD is our inability to shift from the symptoms related to trauma. So people who are diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, they constantly re-experience the traumatic situations. They're on high alert. They have difficult time trusting others. They may avoid certain places because it reminds them of that traumatic experience. And they may have difficult moods and perspectives about the world that was shaped because of the trauma they experience. Another impact to our mental health is intergenerational trauma, and this is experience of trauma that is passed down through generations, as the definition says here. This can influence our children's functioning and even our children's functioning. So there is some truth to mental health being passed down to generations. The Youth XChange, for example, defines intergenerational trauma and as trauma that is transformed from one intergeneration, from the first generation of survivors, to the direct experience to the past, to the second and the further generation. So one generation experienced that trauma, and then that's passed along to the generations. Intergenerational trauma can also be historical and have an emotionally devastating impact on people, especially when it's aimed at a group because of their status as an oppressed group. So this also includes Holocaust survivors, residential schools and Indigenous people, African, Black, and Caribbean people, and other oppressed groups within society. The influence of trauma or intergenerational trauma can influence our development, our brain development. It can change our DNA and thus change future generations. Intergenerational patterns can also be passed down from modeling. So we often parent the same lens that our parents parented, and even through our life experiences with our parents were completely different. In utero is another example. So when mothers are, raising their babies in utero, their pregnancy or their experiences throughout their pregnancy can influence and impact the brain development of that child, which can further influence that child's experiences. However, there's also so much richness in our genes and our stories that can strengthen us. And by identifying the areas that we need to change, we can change the trajectory of the trauma our families experience. My last point is this. What are the steps that we need to take to demystify mental health? First, we have to acknowledge what influence and impacts our mental health, such as anti-Black racism, intergenerational trauma. We need to accept that we have to spend time developing wellness in our lives and remaining really intentional in creating and maintaining an emotional balance. I have a list here, but can you think of anything else that you may need to do? What is shame? There is a strong correlation between experiencing shame and feelings of shame within our community. For Black communities, intergenerational trauma and shame is intertwined and consistent with disruptions. This influences our communities in so many different ways, and how we form relationships with others, how we manage our own emotions and our mental health. And it further influences how we interact with schools, child welfare, health, and so much more. According to Brené Brown, if you may know her, and I quote, "Shame is defined as intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we're flawed and therefore unworthy of love and belonging." Shame is so ingrained within us, and many times found in the stories that we share about ourselves, how we perceive others in our world, and how our family system operates, and with our children. Traumatic experiences heighten the feelings of shame and influence our ability to connect to others. For example, many people who live with shame have difficulty trusting others. They often feel that people are out to get them, or that they need to rely solely on themselves for their survival. When people do not access support, they need to address those feelings of shame. They need to internalize their experiences, and they struggle to manage their emotions. They may even turn to substances or unhealthy behavior to regulate those intense feelings of shame, sadness, guilt, anger, depression, and more. It is important to be mindful how past experiences really influence our thoughts, our feelings, and behaviors. For example, a Toronto psychologist once wrote, "Shame is often the heart of much of mental illness, such as depression, anxiety, and trauma." There are a few books that speak to the Black experience. This is one of my favorites. Brené Brown's book, "You Are the Best Thing," a Toronto book. And Bruce Perry's book, "What Happened to You?" When I think of my own experience, it may have happened with the spankings that I got as a child, or even in kindergarten when I was told that my skin color was dirt. When I read these words on the screen, I want you to consider your own experiences. It may have been something that happened to you, or something someone told you about yourself, or even what you learned from watching other people in the media and more. I also want you to consider how shame can begin in childhood, how children are taught from a very young age between goodness and badness. Or it may have been in that boardroom where you felt that your ideas weren't being valued, or in relationships that may have ended in divorce. If you saw Dr. Smith's presentation last month, he demonstrated how colorism, for example, clearly identified whiteness as the ideal, and that leading many Black people to feel internalized shame because they did not identify with that ideal. So when did you express or internalize that being white was better? When did you feel that you needed to prove to yourself that you were not good enough? When did you feel that your body didn't matter? And when did you feel that your ideas were not valued or important? So when we start to struggle, sometimes the balance can be tipped. Sometimes it happens immediately, and sometimes it takes some time. But it's important that we're diligent to ensure that when our stressors on the one side of the balance beam becomes too high, that we're also adding in in some parts of our identity or parts of our wellness to help maintain that balance. And I'll go back to the symptoms again. So as you can see in column 1, the symptoms of concern, it kind of indicates to you that you need to start adding some additions into your wellness and begin to overemphasize your wellness routine and spend some more time in your self-care. And in column 2, it indicates that intervention is needed now. And if you notice a friend or family member needing intervention, please absolutely reach out. So let's take a moment to pause. What questions are generating in your mind, thinking about how you can be mindful, and also thinking about how you can send messages of love to yourself. Part of our journey of healing is reclaiming stereotypes, experiences, and trauma that has happened to us. Nothing is wrong with you. You are good. It is what has happened to you. As I begin to close the discussion, think of ways you can search for clarity about your own mental health. Consider activities that are central to your wellness and de-escalate in times of crisis. Consider how you can change your own narratives about yourself and perceptions about yourself, your community, and your family. So, full disclosure, I am a Trini. I love soca. I love playing Mass. I think it started when I was a baby playing Mass. For my father, the Mass was his soul, his being, and his culture, and he passed it on to myself and my sisters. I chased a few carnivals, but hold on, I'm a single mom, so I have to do it in budget. In Hamilton, Barrie, New York City, Baltimore, Toronto, Miami, and of course Trinidad. But for many years, I used to feel ashamed of my love for soca. Many people talked about or diminished the quality of my culture and my identity. And I remember being ashamed to talk to white people about Caravana, till one day I saw Rob Ford in the parade with us, dancing and taking pictures in the parade. So I don't anymore. What I had to do was I had to reclaim my identity and define my identity how I wanted to. By demystifying mental health, we're also reclaiming identities, definitions, and belief systems about ourselves. We need to do the same about reclaiming our language, our rights, our histories, our stories, and even our ancestors' stories. And this means that we need to actively reduce the shame about how we speak, our accents, for example. We can begin to start talking clearly about our difficulties and our painful journeys, and we can speak loudly about our successes, regardless of how big or small it may be. We can start to really sit with our elders and listen to their stories, and even begin to document their stories, not yet placed or found in textbooks. By actively reducing shame and walking through the pain, we can learn that demystifying is also allowing ourselves to become vulnerable. Through vulnerability and being uncomfortable, we can begin to change, to grow, and develop. Our journeys all look different, but it is our journey. Now here comes our interventions. When are interventions needed? If wellness is a balancing act, then seeking interventions is needed. And if we can no longer balance our mental health, and we begin to notice that these symptoms disrupt and interrupt our daily living, then we need to look for stronger interventions. And sometimes, as I shared before, our loved ones or friends may notice these changes in us way before we do. Here is a list of diagnoses that people may receive from a medical doctor, a psychiatrist, or a psychologist. However, a diagnosis is just a step in treatment. If you or someone you know is experiencing a mental health challenge, I encourage you not to wait and to seek help. Begin to document your thoughts, your feelings, and experiences. Make sure that you're sharing these with your medical expert, a doctor, or a naturopath. I encourage you to speak to a psychotherapist or counselor or social worker about the difficulties that you may be experiencing, And finally, considering medications as a way to support if your symptoms are too high and it's making it difficult for you to be able to function. For example, if you notice that you're not sleeping due to nightmares, taking medications will help you to sleep. And if you sleep, then you're then motivated to wake up in the morning and engage in the activities that you need to do in your life. So that's what I mean in terms of developing a different cycle. As a caregiver or loved one, someone who experiences mental health difficulties, I encourage you to also seek support. So as I shared before, these experiences impact the entire family. And whether you are in the periphery or in the middle of the drama, it is important to get the support that you need. Some tips and strategies include, creating healthy boundaries, being supportive and non-judgmental. And we think we have the answers for people on their journey, but we actually may not. And people would need to know how you would catch them when they fall. So they need to know that you're going to be there for them, but not judge them in the process. Asking questions to people such as, what do you need? How can I help? And making statements such as, thank you for sharing my pain. As I begin to flow into the interventions, I'm mindful that I've only a few more minutes, but that's fine because that's the good timing. I'd like you to think about in each area, how can you develop one thing intentional that can create balance and feed your soul? When we think about emotional wellness, it inspires self-care, relaxation, reduction in stress, and the development of inner strength. It is important to be attentive to both positive and really difficult feelings and being able to understand how to float through those experiences. So being able to manage or cope with them. Strategies for emotional wellness include some of these approaches that I've listed here above. Self-compassion and kindness is something that we can show to others, but not always ourselves. So treat yourself as though you would treat your best friend. Always be gracious, be kind, forgive yourself, and validate your feelings. Empathy is another important one. Empathy is the ability to take another's perspective, staying out of judgment, being able to connect with others with emotions, and thus by demonstrating empathy towards yourself, you can also build your own emotional intelligence and capacities. Brene Brown, as the book I showed you before, You Are Your Best Thing, talked about, how can you address or deal with shame? And some of the examples they gave here was deconstruct and naming. So being able to talk about your own experience of shame and how it is kind of roped into systems is really important. Being able to connect with communities and build that community helps to also address shame. Being creative, so allowing us to create spaces where we can feel free in the world and express how we're feeling also helps to deal with shame. And developing spirituality and purpose, that helps to really anchor our existence, and it supersedes the here and now. It is just exactly how our ancestors were able to survive enslavement, segregation, systemic racism, immigration wars, famine, and so much more. My favorite one is relationships. So social relationships refers to the relationships and how we interact with each other. And relationships are so important because it can help us and support us through difficult times. The power of relationships helps to build so much for us. So given that the Black community can experience stress interpersonally, but also structurally, healthy relationship and community ties are very important to buffer the impact of those stressors. And many people in the Black community, often feel dispersed and isolated because they don't have those connections with some of their family members. And so they start to create other family members that are part of their family, which is definitely what my family did when we moved to the Durham region. Relationships are really important because they can create stability, improve trust, and reduce isolation and loneliness. The other intervention is physical healing through movement. And so when you think of physical, you think of your physical body, and those are elements that need to be taken care of. So whether it's physical activity, nutrition, sleep, and other important areas. In terms of exercise, yoga, walking, step classes, dance, I can go on, but those are really important suggestions in terms of improving the parts of ourselves. Another important part is intellectual, and I love this quote because it speaks to the importance of empowering our minds. And once we are allowed to explore ourselves, explore our knowledge, it can also build our capacity for learning. So joining book clubs, connecting with community members, attending talks such as these can really help to engage that intellectual part of ourselves. As we begin to close up, we'll look at environmental and spiritual. When it comes to environmental, it really talks about how we can provide or give support within our environmental communities. So by investing within our communities, it really helps to reinforce wellness and create spaces for your children and your family. Some simple activities might be community garden, volunteering within the community, practicing, Earth Day and other areas that kind of help to keep our community safe. Spirituality. Spiritual wellness allows us to be in tune with our spiritual selves, and this realm of wellness lets us find meaning in life events and define our individual purpose. It can be defined through various factors such as faith, having values, ethics, morals, just parts of ourselves that we can hold on to. Regardless of whether you believe in a religious faith, there's always something to be learned when you allow to see yourself within that area. Some of the strategies for inspiring our soul include, remember how I shared earlier about how our soul can be lacerated? Well, spirituality is part of us and part of that healing for us. In reflection, when you're thinking about some of the traditions that have been passed down, our ancestors held onto spirituality as a reason for living and found meaning within their struggles. Spirituality has its place in healing and cultivating balance within our lives. Throughout our discussion today, I encourage pauses for you to encourage you to become more mindful and be of yourself within the moment. In our busy world, mindfulness, for example, really helps us to slow down and focus on the present moment in the here and now. And these practices can help us notice our emotions, our physical body, and our thoughts. So why did you stay here? I encourage you, those who stayed, to create a self-care plan for yourself that includes some of the dimensions of self that we talked about today, and make a commitment to yourself to put yourself first, put your family first, and your community first. And thank you so much for being here. I hope that you've learned that you define your mental health, you define your story, your experiences, and an acceptance and gratitude of those experiences, and showing loving kindness to yourself is incredibly important in demystifying mental health. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole, for sharing your experiences, your expertise, your thoughts, again, lived experiences and contributions to the conversation on demystifying mental health today. For me, mindfulness and reclaiming parts of me or parts of my journey is one of my, or a few of my takeaways. Just as we move to the end of our program, I've got a few questions that have been put forward in the chat. Question one. Kelly Pierce asks, as we approach a new school year, how can we ensure that our children's mental health and wellness is addressed post-pandemic?
That is an excellent question. We actually Kajenga Wellness Project did a presentation a couple of months ago on that very same topic. It's really important. I think one of the things that parents can do as we enter into New Year is just continue to have that dialogue with their children, talk to them about how this experience is impacting them That's really important, giving them that space to talk, and then embedding wellness within your everyday life. So it might be, fun days, fun little moments or activities every single day is really important. Spending some one-on-one time with your children, taking them out to the park, or spending some time in mindfulness or doing yoga activities with them really starts to help build in some of those wellness strategies that can be really important. And then continue that throughout the year. For example, my daughter is a perfectionist. Apparently she takes after her mother. And she often really struggles throughout the year, just wanting to get good grades and achieve her highest. And so even the dialogues that I used in our home really helped to kind of encourage her to see that it's not just about your grades, it's also about creating balance. So dance was really important for her. Playing soccer was really important. And doing the same thing for your children. So involving them in multiple different activities can also help them to develop balance within their everyday life.
Excellent. Question number 2. Raymond Porter asked, I identify as a member of the Black community, and how can I address the stigma around mental health with my elders in my community?
That's an excellent question. As I shared before, when I was growing up, there was a lot of narratives about my grandmother and other family members who struggled with addictions. And interesting enough, my parents, who are in their 70s, are completely changed. And part of what I did was we just had open conversations and we talked about things. And that's how I got to learn about my grandmother's story and her experiences. And I tried to put that in light of, she struggled in certain areas of her life. It makes sense that she had, mental health challenges. So definitely believe talking is really important, encouraging our elders to really share their story and help them to see, how their mental health would have been impacted by those significant experiences that they had within their everyday lives as well.
Thank you. Question 3, Jason Neville. Great presentation. Can you shed some light on the way in which we can currently support the Indigenous community as they process the current social climate? How much space is enough? And for those who want to be respectful to their peers during this time?
That's an excellent question. And as I started in the beginning, even though I immigrated to Canada, was not part of those systems, I'm still enjoying privileges from those systems. So I think our first step is being able to acknowledge and support Indigenous people and become accomplices or allies. The other piece is in 2015, there was a Truth and Reconciliation Act that was put in place and a document that followed with the 94 calls of action. Of those 94 calls of action was to be able to identify the records of children who were buried from residential schools. And that's what we're hearing right now in terms of the school systems, and they're uncovering some of these graves that were unmarked. This experience is an example of how we can be an ally. So reviewing the 94 calls of action, joining in efforts to support Indigenous people, taking courses. There's many courses offered online. They can also take to kind of improve your understanding of the experiences of Indigenous people and how they supported Canada in so many different ways, and how they developed relationships and friendships with the European settlers who came initially. Those are some of the key factors. And I also found a website too, we can share it after, that really talks about some of the action steps that you can take to become an ally. So, following some of those ideas can also be very helpful.
Nicole, again, thank you so much, and to everyone for your questions, and to the platform that we're currently on. Just a reminder that we encourage you all to access the resources and information on the task force, especially the information that's on our Facebook page. Again, this topic today was demystifying mental health within our community, and this information will be available for those who want to seek further information on programming or other opportunities. Back to you, Natasha.
Okay, I was muted. Thank you, Dane, for being our wonderful facilitator for the evening. And thank you to our speaker, Nicole Perryman, for your time and dedication in contributing to the conversation on demystifying mental health and sharing your presentation with us tonight. To continue the conversation, please visit us at ajax.ca/taskforce or facebook.com/AABRTF. And as usual, you can always connect with us on our Town of Ajax social media platforms. Thank you and have a great afternoon.